Hello, so today we are going to go over background of invasive species, and then after that in class we are going to talk about wildlife diseases. The reason why we're going through all of these before we talk about wildlife management is because these things make wildlife management very, very difficult for us. All right, so starting with invasive species. So what does it mean to be an invasive species? Well, it's a species that usually comes from one area to another, and we find that a lot of invasive species are human introduced. They can be a plant, an animal, a fungi, a microorganism, so think like bacteria. And invasive species are always going to be able to spread really, really rapidly and harm the ecosystem that they are in. Invasive species tend to be very virulent. And what that means is from one organism, they make a lot of babies or anything like that. And another thing that invasive species do is they take over a niche of a local organism. So, what that means is if we have a small population of an animal that does a certain niche, an invasive species is going to come in, do that niche better than the animal that was already there, and replace them and invade. Doing this harms that local animal because it takes away their environmental job. Invasive species don't always have to be non-native. So a lot of examples that I have up here are Asian carp. They're prevalent in the Mississippi River and obviously not from here, they're from Asia. Zebra mussels, which are in Lake Michigan, buckthorn, sea lampreys, and emerald ash borer. However, if a population of local animals surpasses their carrying capacity, we also consider them to be invasive. An example of this is something we're going to talk about a little bit later in a little bit more detail, but an example of this would be the mountain pine beetle. So this is a beetle that kills trees very similar to how the emerald ash borer does, and we're going to go into the emerald ash borer a little bit later. And this is a native pest that lives in like the Rocky Mountain ecosystem. Because of climates that are changing, we have longer growing seasons. This means that this mountain pine beetle, instead of one reproductive cycle a year, it now has two. So if you do the math, we now have double the amount of these mountain pine beetles, and it's causing massive, massive pine die-off. So it went from being a controlled native species that every winter would have a freeze, it would kill a lot of them, and the ecosystem was able to maintain a safe level. And now they get two growing seasons and less harsh winters that don't kill off a lot of those animals. So they have far surpassed their carrying capacity. And we have that down below here. Invasive species lower the carrying capacity of the habitat for everything else because they take away all the food and resources and the things that the local animals need. So on your sheet, I want you guys to answer, what is an invasive species? Are they always introduced? So are they always brought from somewhere else? And how do they affect the biodiversity and carrying capacity of a habitat? So when I was talking about like competing for a niche, if we remember, a habitat and niche are two things that kind of get confused sometimes. So a habitat is where the animal or organism lives. The niche is its environmental job and what it actually does for that habitat. Because of their impact, invasive species form a habitat disturbance by taking over niches, and they do it very, very well. An example that I like to use is like the automated checkouts at grocery stores and other big box stores. They are very efficient and good at what they do, and they have taken over the jobs that cashiers normally would have. So that would be considered, quote unquote, an invasive species. These things are going to disrupt and displace native species that occupy the same niche. And the reason why this is important, it's not just getting rid of that one animal, but niches and jobs are so often connected to each other. So an example that I have behind me right here off to, oh, which way? Off to the side, is when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, because in the 1900s they killed off all the wolves in Yellowstone. Elk populations soared, they ate all the plants, very, very bad for the ecosystem. So in the 1990s, scientists are like, you know what? We should probably put wolves back here because this is where they belong. So they put wolves back. It reduced the elk population to a sustainable level for that ecosystem. But then what it also did is it increased berry population, because without elk to eat all the different berries and stuff, berries were able to grow. Because these berries were able to grow at a once again sustainable and good level, it actually increased the survival of grizzly bears that count on that, because they are omnivores, because they eat a lot of veg and a lot of meat. They really, really counted on those berries, and once they grew back, they did great. So if we had an invasive species come in that got rid of these berries, not only would it influence and affect all of the berries that were there, it would also influence and affect the herbivores that relied on those for nutrients, as well as our omnivores and our grizzly bears. So everything is all connected. So on your sheet, make sure to answer the next question. So which species in a habitat do invasive species most affect? What is a niche? And do invasive species affect other species outside of their niche? And explain how niches are interconnected. One thing I'll add to help with this, which species in a habitat do invasive species most affect? The first question on there, they're going to affect fragile species that have a very specific niche. So think like panda bears only eat bamboo. They're going to affect those species the most that have a very specific job, or species that already have a very low unsustainable level. They're going to hurt those species. So endangered species, threatened species, they're going to hurt them a little bit more. Let's see how many times I can say species. Somebody just start tallying. Okay. So the next part of this that we have is something called the competitive exclusion principle. So let's break it down. Competitive, we all know that means competition, fighting against each other. Exclusion, so that means that through competition, we are now going to exclude somebody. Like, you lost, you need to leave. Okay, so it's kind of like a bracket and then principle. Okay, so the competitive exclusion principle says if there are two species competing for the same niche, one species is going to win, one's going to lose. There are no species participation trophies. So if we have two predators competing for the same prey, the less competitive predator needs to find a new prey source, or it needs to find a new territory, or it's going to starve and die. That's just how it is. So for example, in Wisconsin right now, we have a massive, massive coyote population. That's hurting our fox population because they tend to eat a lot of the same like little mammals like chipmunks and squirrels and rabbits and all of that stuff. So foxes have had to been really creative and find other food sources. Invasive species also lack predators. So when they go to a new environment, they're like, I'm the new kid in town. Everyone likes me because I'm the bright, shiny new thing. And they often don't have any predators. And this can be a massive, massive problem. One example of this is, and we're going to talk more about them later, of course, as with everything, is feral pigs everywhere. Pigs are very mean. As somebody who has raised pigs for most of my growing up, pigs can be very, very mean on instinct. Pigs have been introduced everywhere all over the world by Europeans. And this is a massive problem for a lot of ecosystems. Namely, my example I'm going to use is the island of Hawaii. So pigs were brought over by European settlers, and they completely ravaged the understory and have killed lots and lots of native bird species because they had no predators. You know, these pigs were going rampant on the Hawaiian Islands. There were no predators for anything. There were just bird species that lived there, some snakes, lizards, reptiles, stuff like that. there were no big mammal predators. Everything that's been brought to those islands is considered invasive, and they've done very, very well in the lush rainforests, and because nothing kills them. So now on the Hawaiian Islands, people can actually go there, and for very, very inexpensive, they can hunt feral pigs and lots of other species that were brought over and introduced because they are ravaging those ecosystems. Another example that we have down below is the example of Norway rats. They also were brought to the Hawaiian Islands, and they also eliminated bird species because typically rats are going to be eaten by really small mammals, and there were none there to eat them. So they just completely took off. All right, so on your Google Sheet, I want you guys to explain the competitive exclusion principle and how does it relate to the problem of invasive species. And then in addition to outcompeting species in the same niche, in what other ways do invasive species harm habitats? So you might want to look up some stuff on Norway rats and feral pigs to help you explain those answers. Oh my gosh, I'm like lost in the middle of all these invasive species. Oh my gosh, got to get out of here. Well, I'll just exist here. Okay, so some characteristics of invasive species. They're either going to check all of these boxes, some of these boxes. These are different things that make species invasive. They grow really, really fast and they outcompete. They make a lot of babies. So think like rats, tons of babies. Pigs, they can have up to like 16, 17 piglets in one litter. That's so many babies. And they're at a reproductive age very, very young. This is the reason why a lot of invasive species are insects, because like you wait 3 days and they're an adult, and then they make a bunch of babies. The other thing that is really unique about a lot of invasive species and what makes them invasive is that their seeds, eggs, anything like that can survive really, really harsh conditions. They can travel long distances. They don't have predators. They are the Chuck Norris of animals and plants. Their native region has a climate similar to their affected habitat. This one I want to highlight because not a lot of people know this one. But Wisconsin's habitat and our climate is very, very similar to where else in the world? Yes, yes, this is where I get to be Dora the Explorer. That's right. If you said China, that's awesome. This is the reason why we have so many Asian pests, because if you look at like the latitude lines around the world, we are on the same latitude as certain regions of China where they also have a lot of coastal fresh water, which we have with the Great Lakes. Or theirs isn't fresh water, there's a salt water, but still water sources. We can actually look at this as well. So when you think of Door County, Wisconsin, you think of cherries. That's what I think of. The only other place in the world that grows the type of cherries that we find in Door County, Wisconsin is China. Wisconsin is also #1 in the United States for the production of ginseng, which is predominantly an Asian crop. It's like a little root crop that's used in a lot of medicines and things like that. It grows really well in Wisconsin. This is one of the reasons why we have Asian beetles and Asian carp and all of these things, because they do really, really well in our habitat. Okay, so on your sheet, I want you guys to answer what characteristics are common to invasive species. So just pick 4 that are the biggest ones, and like with what you know about things that are invasive, kind of explain it a little bit. And then what are 3 species native to North America that might become invasive in other parts of the world because they should share some of these characteristics? So think, oh my gosh, excuse me. So think about 3 species that we have in North America that might do well somewhere else in the world. And if you can't think of 3, that's fine. Try to at least think of 1, but try to think of 3 that might do well somewhere else and really take off somewhere else. All right, habitat generalists. Invasive species do really well because they're not picky. Typically, they're going to be animals that don't have specific dietary needs and they can just eat anything. Think pigs. This is why they are so invasive. So the maps that I have behind me, this is the spread of feral pigs in the United States over 21 years. They are now found in all 50 states. Not yet in sustainable populations, but they are found. Yes, we do have feral pigs in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, you only need a small game license and there is no limit because they are so damaging to the environment. Invasive species are also generalists because they can adapt to so many habitats and ecosystems. They don't have specific nutrition needs. They are just beasts. They can do what they want. And invasive species generally outcompete and displace habitat specialists. So once again, an example that I use of a specialist is a panda bear because they're only going to eat bamboo. So an invasive species is going to take over their job because they're going to eat not only bamboo, but everything else. They're going to take that away from everything else in that environment. So on your Google Sheet, make sure to answer what is a habitat generalist? How does this affect whether or not a species can become invasive? And how does habitat generalist differ than a specialist? So generalist is going to be able to eat everything. A specialist has a very unique set of skills or a very specific niche that allows it to live only in that environment or in that place. When we're talking about species being invasive, it's also often like a two-step process. So just because a species goes into an area, they're not usually going to be invasive unless they're aided somehow by human activity. So only about 10% of introduced species become invasive, or I'm sorry, they survive in a new environment, and about 1% become invasive. Human activity can disrupt this in two ways, and that is transportation and disturbance. So most invasive species are brought into habitat by transportation. So shipping containers, that's how emerald ash borer got here, we think. Bilge tanks on boats, shoes, walking through caves and things like that. That there's a disease we're going to talk about called white nose syndrome in bats. And that's how that one got spread. Clothing on pets or releasing pets into an ecosystem like boa constrictors in the Everglades in Florida. When people didn't like their pet anymore, they just put it out into the ecosystem, and now boa constrictors are very invasive. The second step to this is habitat disturbances. So disturbances allow newly transported species to become established. So when we have a disturbance such as a forest fire or anything like that, but sometimes it can be natural, sometimes human caused. What that does is it takes away like all of the niches. So then when that invasive species is there, it has a bunch of jobs it can just take over. And because they reproduce very, very quickly, and they don't have a specific job that they need, when there's a disturbance, they can just swoop in and take all of the jobs from everything else and disallow native species from becoming reestablished after some sort of a disaster. So, like land conversion for agriculture, clear cutting of a forest, anything like that. All right, so on your Google Sheet, make sure to answer, do most species become invasive? And what is the two-step process? So what are the two things that have to happen typically for an animal to become invasive? So that is all that I want you guys to do for today. We will pick up tomorrow in person in class. Toodaloo.